The cold came down before the sun did. It always did out here on the edge of known space. Mara Voss pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. She had been walking since before first light, same as the others. The ones she could see and the ones she could only hear. Footsteps in the pre-dawn dark of the corridor, boots on compacted regolith, breath coming out in small white ghosts. The corridor was the name humans had given to the narrow strip of habitable latitude on Kethara 7. A band of temperate ground barely 40 kilometers wide that ran like a scar between two zones of alien geography too hostile for anyone to live in. The humans had not named it out of pride. They had named it the way you name the only door in a burning building. Because it was what you had. She passed a man with his jacket open despite the cold. She recognized him, Fenn, one of the dock workers from sub-level 3. He had his fists in his pockets and was walking fast, and he didn't look at her but he nodded. She nodded back. Up ahead she could see the shapes of more people against the pale sky, bundled into whatever they owned. A woman carrying a child, 3 older men who walked with the careful gait of the long-tired. A pair of young workers in coveralls still stamped with the logo of an extraction company that had liquidated 6 months ago and left them with unpaid wages and a piece of paper saying sorry about that. All of them moving in the same direction. All of them moving toward the green space. Behind her, somewhere in the dark, she thought she could hear the low harmonic that meant a Karat patrol drone. She didn't look back. Looking back, she had learned, was how you told the drone you were afraid. You kept your head forward. You kept walking. The Karat could read posture for the same as humans read faces, and a face turned backward over a shoulder meant the same thing to them as a flinch. She had learned a lot about the Karat in the 4 years since occupation. Most of it she would rather not have known. The corridor had been claimed as a resource zone 17 months after the Karat fleet established orbital dominance. They had not announced this. They had not delivered ultimatums or transmitted official documents, or done any of the things that human diplomatic training insisted that occupying powers were supposed to do. They had simply begun to act as though the land was theirs, and when humans pushed back, legally, politically, in whatever fractured institutional ways still remained. The Karat had demonstrated, with the patience of something very old and very certain of itself, that none of those mechanisms applied. The Karat Directorate did not recognize human legal standing. They did not recognize the concept of prior claim by a species they classified as migratory opportunistic. They did not, as far as anyone could determine, recognize that humans experience things in a way that counted as experience. They weren't cruel. That was the part that kept Mara awake at night. More than the patrols and the resource levies and the curfews. The Karat weren't cruel. Cruelty required a relationship, a recognition of the other's capacity to suffer. What the Karat had instead was a total structural absence of acknowledgement. They didn't hate humans. They didn't fear them or envy them or want to humiliate them. They simply did not see them, not in any way that mattered, and they had built an entire civilization on that not seeing. Mara reached the ridge and stopped. Below her, the corridor opened out into its widest section, a flat expanse that had been called, by the first settlers, the Common. The original name had been something more official. Provisional Settlement Zone 19, but nobody had called it that in 30 years. The Common was where the market ran on 5th days, where kids played in the summer, where the memorial stones had been placed for the 700 who died when the Karat closed the water reclamation facility without notice, and 3 sub-districts ran dry. And now, in the pale beginning light, Mara could see them. She had known they were coming. She had known the numbers, more or less. The organizing had been careful, spread through networks that moved in person, rather than through comm channels the Karat monitored. But knowing a number and seeing it were different things. The people coming off the access roads into the Common were not a crowd. They were something larger than a crowd. They moved with the quality of something geographic, like a river, like weather. She could see the red of the solidarity banners they carried, catching the first light, and it was a color she had not seen at scale in 4 years. And something in her chest did a thing she didn't have a name for. She started down the slope toward them. The Solidarity Walk had been proposed by a woman named Theodis Baum, who ran a food cooperative out of what used to be a machine shop in the northern sub-district, and who had a talent for saying complicated things simply. "We need to be where they can see us being together," Theodis had said, at a meeting that Mara had attended along with 47 others, sitting on crates and spare chairs in the cold back room, not to fight them. Not to ask them anything, just to be together in a place large enough that the number can't be ignored. Someone had asked what that would accomplish. "I don't know," Theodis had said, "but it will accomplish us. Mara had thought about that phrase for weeks. It will accomplish us. She wasn't sure what it meant, exactly, and she suspected that was part of the point. There were things language could only gesture toward. She found her section. The medical workers' block, which she had organized, near the southern entrance to the common, gathered around a hand-drawn banner that someone had made from a strip of cargo insulation fabric. 22 people, she had expected 15. She stood at the edge of the group and counted them again, because it seemed important to be exact, and she was at 23 when someone touched her elbow. It was Paul Essig, who worked in the trauma unit, and was the closest thing to a friend Mara had in this settlement. If friend was the right word for someone you got drunk with twice a year and relied on in emergencies. He was tall and angular and looked perpetually underslept, which was because he perpetually was. You counted us, he said. Twice. We're 23, I know. 8 more than you planned for. I know, she said again. He handed her a thermal cup. She drank from it without asking what was in it, which was the nature of trust. It was tea. She had expected something worse, and the tea felt, in some small way she couldn't fully account for, like a kindness that cost him something. The Carrot observation post at the north end has been active since midnight, Pole said quietly. They've got at least 2 drones aloft, and I saw a ground vehicle on the perimeter. They're going to let us walk, Mara said. You think. The directorate calculates outcomes. They'll have run the numbers on what happens if they stop us versus what happens if they watch us. Stopping us turns this into something. Watching us, they keep it as nothing. Pole looked out over the common at the thousands of people moving through it. Is this nothing? To them it might still be. That's what we're trying to find out. The sky was going from gray to white to the thin, sharp blue of Cathara 7 mornings. Mara put the thermal cup in her coat pocket and walked to the front of the medical workers section, and they fell in behind her without being told to. Because they were people who understood that sometimes you move toward the thing rather than away from it. And that instinct was why she had organized them specifically. The walk to the green space was 11 kilometers. For the first 2, nobody said much. The sound was feet and fabric, the occasional cough, the creak of the solidarity banners in the wind. The Carrot drone kept its distance but was visible. A dark ovoid shape 300 meters up, moving in the slow arc of surveillance, its sensor cluster swiveling the way a face turns toward sound. Mara watched it without staring at it. There was a technique to this. You acknowledged it the way you acknowledged weather, present but not the point. By the 3rd kilometer, the silence had become something different. It wasn't absence. It was the particular quality of shared, deliberate quiet, the sound of many people deciding together not to speak, because speaking would break something they were holding. Mara had heard this kind of silence at memorial services. She had heard it once during a dust storm, when the entire settlement sheltered in the primary hub, and 2,400 people waited together for the sensors to say it had passed. It was the sound of people discovering they were larger than themselves. The drone was joined by a second one at the 4-kilometer mark. At 5 kilometers, she noticed the watchers. They were Carrot, standing at the roadside in the posture their species used for directed observation. Forward lean, secondary arms folded inward, primary arms extended at 45 degrees. They were not uniformed in any human sense. The Carrot marked status and function through bioluminescent patterning rather than clothing. And the ones watching the march showed the pale blue gold of administrative authority. Not soldiers. Not police in any sense humans use the word. Auditors, someone had once called them. The ones who watched and counted and fed data to the directorate's endless calculus. One of them turned to follow the march with its full visual array as Mara's section passed. It was a slow movement, deliberate, and the eye clusters at the center of its angular head were fully dilated, the pale amber of maximum data uptake. Mara kept walking. Beside her, she heard Pole make a sound very low in his throat. Not fear. Something more complicated. They're counting us, he said. Yes. Does it change anything? Being counted by them? She thought about it. It means we're legible, she finally said. We exist in their record. Even if that record says we're nothing, we're something that got recorded as nothing. That's a start. They walked. At 7 kilometers, the road curved and the green space came into view. The only significant patch of native vegetation in the corridor that had been left alone rather than cleared, a spread of low blue-gray ground cover and the clustered stalks of something that wasn't quite a tree and wasn't quite anything else, reaching up with the particular lean of things that grew in wind. The original settlement planners had set it aside as an atmospheric stabilizer. The settlers had made it into something else. There were benches there, made from salvage materials. There was a low stone platform where speeches were given and music was played on fifth days. There were children's markers in the ground at the edge, small personal ceremonies observed by people who had needed a place to put them. The first groups were already arriving. Mara heard them before she saw them. Not cheering, not the roar of a rally, but something quieter and more sustained. The sound of many thousands of voices in the ordinary register of conversation, the collective murmur of people who had traveled a long way to be with other people and were now simply together. It was a sound she had not heard at that scale in 4 years. It had the quality of water, of wind, of things that do not require permission to exist. She stopped at the edge of the green space and turned back to look at the road she had come from. The march was still filling in behind her. She could see it stretching back along the curve of the road as far as the light allowed, a column of people in coats and scarves, and the occasional flash of bare-armed athletes who had apparently decided cold was a political statement, all moving forward in the steady and particular way of people who have chosen to be somewhere and mean to get there. She thought of the first settlers. She thought of her grandmother, who had been on the third transport, and had spent the first 2 years living in a pressurized tent, and had called those years the best of her life, which Mara had always found baffling, and now, standing here, did not find baffling at all. The Carrot post at the northern end of the green space was fully staffed. She could see 6 auditors on the elevated platform, sensor clusters trained on the crowd. 2 drones held station above the crowd, steady as installation hardware. The data going back to the directorate would be comprehensive. Good, Mara thought, let them count. She had heard the directorate's position on human habitation in the corridor, relayed through the series of communication protocols that substituted for diplomacy in this situation. Cathara 7's human settlers were classified under Category 9 of the Carrot Administrative Code, opportunistic ancillary biological presences, to be managed in accordance with resource optimization rather than relocation cost-benefit until further assessment. It was a sentence that had been written by something that processed the world entirely in columns of net value, and reading it, she had read it many times, produced in her a particular kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. But here was the thing. The Carrot Directorate, with its 1,000 years of continuous civilization and its fleet of ships that could unmake a settlement from orbit, and its absolute comfort, with the knowledge that they were the dominant intelligence in this sector, and everything else was margin. The Carrot Directorate had not, in 4 years of occupation, been able to account for this. For the specific and unreasonable way humans persisted, she moved into the crowd. Around her, the medical workers dispersed into the larger mass of people, and she let them go, because they didn't need to be organized anymore. They were already part of something that organized itself. She moved through the crowd slowly, not looking for anyone in particular, just moving, reading the thing she was inside of. Theodis Baum found her near the central platform. She was shorter than Mara remembered. Mara had always encountered her at tables in rooms, and height reads differently in open space. And she was wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and had a cup of something hot in each hand. She gave one to Mara without prelude. "How many?" Mara said. "We stopped counting at 80,000, the counter jammed." Theodis said it without triumph, which was correct. Triumph would have been the wrong note. The Carrot have their own count. "I know." Theodis looked over at the northern post. "Let them have it. Numbers are the only language they share with us right now. If we can make our number large enough, maybe the translation goes through." "What do we do if it doesn't?" Theodis looked at her, with the steady gaze of someone who has thought about this more than is comfortable. "Then we do this again," she said, "and again after that. We do this until they have to reclassify us, or until we figure out what else to do." "That's not a plan." "No," Theodis agreed. "It's a practice." Mara thought about Category 9, opportunistic ancillary biological presences. She looked around at 80,000 people who had walked 11 kilometers in the cold to stand in a park together. She thought, the word opportunistic is doing more work than they know. The first speaker on the platform was a man named Arvin who ran the District Water Collective and had a voice that carried without amplification, which was useful. He did not give a speech so much as say aloud the things that everyone present already knew, which was a different kind of speech, the kind that works by acknowledgement rather than argument. He named the water reclamation facility. He named the 700. He named the families currently subject to risk levies so severe that people were rationing heat in a habitat built for temperature control. He did not yell any of this. He said it in the matter-of-fact register of a man reading a ledger, which was worse than yelling, and the crowd was quiet throughout in the way that the march had been quiet. Deliberately, collectively, holding something. Mara stood at the edge of the crowd and listened and looked at the auditor post. The auditors were still watching. The drones were still recording. The directorate's machinery was taking this all in, running it through the calculus, producing outputs that would feed policy decisions, resource allocations, the thousand small mechanisms of administration that were the actual texture of occupation. And then something happened that she had not expected. It started near the back of the crowd. She heard it before she saw it, a sound building from the direction of the road, from the people still arriving. It was singing. She didn't recognize it immediately. Not because it was obscure, but because she hadn't heard it in years. Hadn't heard it in this place. Hadn't heard it at this scale. It was one of the old labor anthems from Earth. The kind that had been written in a century she had only read about. In a struggle she knew only from history. And it was being sung badly in at least 3 different keys by people who only half remembered the words. And it was the most beautiful thing she had heard in 4 years. It spread. It moved through the crowd the way cold moves through a building. Not through the air, but through the structure itself. Through the connected fact of people standing together. The people around Mara picked it up imperfectly, filling in lyrics where they knew them, and humming where they didn't. And she found herself humming too, the tune more than the words. And she thought of her grandmother in the pressurized tent. Her grandmother who had come across space with almost nothing, and had called it the best time of her life. And she thought she understood now. It wasn't the achievement, it was the we. At the auditor post, something was happening. She noticed it because Pol was suddenly at her elbow, his hand on her arm, not urgent but present. "Look at the north post," he said quietly. The 6 auditors had shifted their formation. The Kirat used posture as language. She knew this, had studied it, had made herself learn it. And what she was seeing now was not the forward lean of observation. It was something else. The primary arms were no longer at 45 degrees. They were drawn in, slightly, to the body. The bioluminescence had changed register. The pale blue gold of administrative authority had shifted towards something she had only seen in records, in transcripts of the very first contact negotiations, in the archived footage that the directorate had released to demonstrate what they considered significant. The pale blue gold had gone to silver. Silver in the Kirat signaling system was the color of recalculation, the color of a model being revised. "They're updating something," Pol said. "Yes," Mara said. "Their estimate, their category." She watched the auditors standing in their silver light, their sensor clusters still trained on the crowd, the drones still overhead, and around her 80,000 voices carrying a tune badly and entirely without shame. "They filed us under Category 9. They're finding out what Category 9 can do." She had spent 4 years thinking about the Kirats not seeing, about the structural blindness of a civilization that sorted everything it encountered into resource value columns, and had simply never developed the cognitive tools to see what she was watching now. They were 1,000 years of continuous success. They had encountered dozens of species. They had never been wrong about a Category 9. But then they had never run the model on something that walked 11 kilometers in the cold and then sang off-key in a park. The thing the Kirat calculus could not hold was this. Humans got more stubborn when things got worse. The directorate had applied resource pressure in the way that worked on every other species they had managed. And every incremental tightening had produced not compliance but escalation of the exact behavior they were trying to suppress. 4 years of occupation had not reduced human activity in the corridor. It had increased it. Every festival that was cancelled became a reason for a bigger one the next year. Every levy protest that was dispersed became the organizing seed for something larger. The directorate had a model for despair. They did not have a model for this. The singing ran its course. 3 verses and a ragged trailing off that ended in scattered laughter. The particular laughter of people who know they have just done something earnest and are not embarrassed about it. And then Thea's bomb was on the platform. She did not raise her voice. "You came," she said, and waited. The crowd was quiet. 80,000 of you came 11 kilometers to stand in the cold, she said. "I want you to understand what you've done by coming. Not what we're asking for, not what we might achieve, what you have already done by being here." She paused. She had the pause of someone who had learned that silence deployed correctly was not empty. "You have been legible," she said. "In a system that is trying very hard not to see you, you have made yourselves too large and too many to not be seen. That's not nothing, that is in fact the thing. Everything else follows from that." Mara watched the auditors. The silver had not faded. The directorate's decision architecture was hierarchical. Policy changes required the model output to cross a certain threshold before it triggered review, and review was what the silver signaled. The auditors were feeding data in real time, and the data was producing a recalculation, and the recalculation was producing silver. She didn't know what came after silver. She didn't know what the review would conclude, how long it would take, what the policy outputs would be. She was a medical worker in a settlement that had been classified as Category 9 by an alien civilization with 1,000 years of unbroken success, and she had no way of knowing if today would change anything in any structural sense. But she knew the auditors were standing in silver light, and she knew 80,000 people were standing in the cold, having walked 11 kilometers to be here, and she knew, not as theory but as the deep knowledge that lives in the body, in the lungs, in the shared warmth of people close together against the temperature, that these were not unrelated facts. She found Pole afterward, near the benches at the edge of the green space where some of the older marchers were sitting down, and someone had produced food from somewhere. The way someone always produced food at these things. The way humans would organize a meal at the end of the world, because eating together was the most fundamental politics. She sat next to him on a bench made from salvaged hull plating and ate something she couldn't identify and didn't need to and didn't ask about. "What now?" he said, same as Theodes said, again and again. "Even if the review goes against us, especially then." He was quiet for a while. She could still hear music from somewhere in the green space. A different song now, something she didn't recognize, something that might have been composed here, on Kethera 7, in the corridor, music that had never been played anywhere else and would not have existed without the occupation to write it into existence. She thought that was the kind of thing that wouldn't translate into a policy review document. The kind of thing that happened sideways to the official record. "My grandmother used to say," Mara said, "that you could tell a lot about people by what they do when it's cold, and the cause looks lost." Pole looked at the crowd still filling the green space. "What do? We put on coats, we make tea, we walk." Above them, one of the Karot drones made a slow pass over the green space, sensor cluster sweeping, recording everything. Mara watched it go. She thought of 80,000 pairs of boots on the road before dawn. She thought of the tea Pole had handed her, without asking. She thought of the singing, badly done and entirely meant. She thought of the silver light on the auditors' skins. She had not solved anything today. She had not liberated the corridor or overturned Category 9, or achieved a single measurable change in the material conditions of human settlement on Kethera 7. But she had been part of something that was now in the Karot record, and the Karot record was how the Directorate saw the world. And the Directorate had been trying to see humans as nothing. And today it was looking at 80,000 people walking in the cold and singing off-key and eating food produced from nowhere, and sitting on benches made from salvaged wreckage. And what it saw there, what it had to file under some category in its enormous and carefully maintained understanding of the universe. That wasn't nothing. That was, as Theodos had said, the thing. The food ran out around midday and nobody minded. People began the walk back in small groups and large ones, some of them still singing, some quiet, all of them carrying the particular lightness of people who have done something that cost them exactly what it was supposed to cost, and produced exactly the thing it was supposed to produce, which was themselves. Mara walked back with her 23. She counted them again at the trailhead, because she was the kind of person who counted things, and they were all there, every one of them, plus 2 who had joined from other sections somewhere in the green space, and had apparently simply decided to come home with the medical workers, which seemed right to her. 25. The drone followed them for 6 kilometers and then peeled away toward the northern post, its surveillance complete. She watched it go without the stiffening she usually felt when she saw them, the reflex of being watched. What she felt instead was something she struggled to name. Something in the vicinity of "we have been seen and we did not flinch." Something that did not yet have a word in the languages of the corridor but was becoming one. Pole was walking beside her with his hands in his pockets, and his jacket still not fully closed, which she had stopped trying to understand. "Do you think the review will help?" he said. "I think the review will think," she said. "That's more than before. The difference between being invisible and being unresolved." Yes, he considered that. "I suppose that's progress." "I suppose it is." The corridor was warming as the day reached its middle hours, the cold retreating to the edge of the habitable band where it lived, patient, waiting. They walked in a long, loose column through the familiar geography of their constrained lives. The access roads, the perimeter markers, the resource monitoring stations that blinked their quiet data upward to the Kherat satellites. All of it the same as it had been this morning, and none of it quite the same. In the northern observation post, the auditor's bioluminescence had returned to its usual pale blue-gold, but the report had been filed. The review had been flagged. Somewhere in the directorate's vast and ancient administrative architecture, a number had been updated, and a category was being examined by minds that had not needed to examine it in a very long time. Category 9 did not sing. Category 9 did not walk 11 kilometers before dawn in the cold. Category 9 did not produce banners from cargo insulation and food from nowhere, and 23 people where 15 were expected. The directorate had 1,000 years of unbroken success because it updated its models when the data required it. The data was requiring it. Mara Voss walked home through the corridor with the red banner of the medical workers section folded under her arm, and the cold settling back in around her, and 25 people behind her, and overhead the alien sky doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware that something had happened here today that mattered, or maybe not entirely unaware. There was a reading in the atmospheric sensors she'd seen once, a pattern in the data that the settlement meteorologist couldn't explain. A recurring warm anomaly in the middle latitudes of the corridor that tracked, imprecisely, with human habitation. They had written it off as a calibration error. She had never quite believed that. She tucked the banner more firmly under her arm and kept walking, toward home, toward the work that still needed doing, in the cold in the corridor, under the wide and complicated sky. The review took 9 days. Mara knew this because she was one of the people who tracked the auditor post, not officially, not as part of any organized surveillance, but in the way that the settlement tracked everything that mattered, through the distributed attention of people who happened to walk past a thing and report back to people who happened to ask. The silver bioluminescence had faded by the second morning. The auditors had returned to their usual pale blue-gold of routine observation. The drones still ran their patterns. Nothing changed in any visible way. But the data couriers who moved between the northern and southern posts were making more trips than usual. 3 of the settlement's technically inclined residents, 2 of them teenagers who had grown up entirely under occupation and had a preternatural facility with signal analysis, confirmed that the encrypted Kherat comm traffic had increased by somewhere between 40 and 80% in the week following the march. They couldn't decode it. Nobody could decode Kherat administrative encryption, but volume was its own kind of signal. The directorate was talking about them. That had never happened before. Not in 4 years. Mara tried not to make too much of it. She had a particular alertness to the human tendency to find patterns in noise when the noise concerned something important. And the desire to believe that the march had produced a structural shift was exactly the kind of desire that could manufacture evidence for itself. She was a medical worker. She knew how confirmation bias behaved in conditions of stress. She applied that knowledge to herself with the same diligence she applied it to her patients. But she kept walking past the auditor post, and she kept tracking the courier trips. On the 7th day after the march, she was at the supply depot when she ran into Yael Oster, who was one of the settlement's oldest residents. She had been born in the corridor, one of the first generation to be born rather than arrived, and who had spent the last 3 years attempting to communicate directly with the Kherat through every available channel, without success, as a private project that everyone respected and nobody talked about because the hope embedded in it was too painful to acknowledge. Yael was picking up water rations and didn't look up when Mara stopped beside her. She was a small woman with very white hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had outlived several forms of certainty. "I heard they're reviewing the category system," Mara said. She had not meant to lead with that. She had meant to say hello. Yael didn't look up. "Where did you hear that?" "Inference. From the comm traffic, among other things." Yael set her water canisters down and looked at Mara with the appraising gaze she used for information she needed to assess. "The thing about a review," she said, "is that it can go any direction. A review doesn't mean improvement. A review means they weren't sure anymore. That seems like a meaningful distinction. It is. Certainty is the condition they operate best in. When they're certain about a category, they implement. When they're uncertain, they pause and study." She picked the canisters back up. Uncertainty is the closest thing they have to mercy. Mara walked home thinking about that. Uncertainty as mercy. The Kherat Directorate had been certain about humanity's category for 4 years. and in that certainty had implemented a policy that was slowly, systematically degrading the conditions of human life in the corridor. Not through violence, not through any act that could be called atrocity in the human legal frameworks that no longer applied here, but through the grinding administrative logic of resource optimization, the 10,000 small adjustments that added up to something people had to find a word for and had settled on slow erasure. The water facility, the output levies, the curfews that weren't called curfews but were functionally curfews, the communication restrictions that weren't bans, but required a permitting process so time-consuming and uncertain that it produced the same result as a ban. If uncertainty made them pause, if 80,000 people in the cold had introduced a variable into the model that the model couldn't confidently categorize, then the practice made sense. Not as a plan, as a practice. She sat in her apartment that night and wrote out, in longhand because the comm logs were monitored, what she thought was actually happening. Not what she hoped, what she thought. The Karot operated on predictive models. Every species they had managed in their thousands of expansion had behaved in ways that, once the model was correctly parametered, remained in the predicted range. You applied pressure, behavior bent in the expected direction, you updated the operational parameters. Efficient, stable, self-conversing, in the way that successful models always became self-conversing. But humanity, she wrote, had a feature the Karot models weren't built for. The more thoroughly humans were reduced, the more thoroughly they documented the reduction. They didn't stop gathering. They didn't become atomized. They became, if anything, more intentional about gathering, because the gathering became the defiance itself, and the defiance kept them human in the deepest sense of the word, kept them legible to themselves, which was the prerequisite for everything else. The Karot couldn't model this because it didn't parse as a logical strategy. It wasn't a logical strategy, it was something else. It was the particular stubbornness of a species that had been walking toward things for 200,000 years, and had discovered, somewhere in the Pleistocene, that walking toward things together was the one activity that reliably produced outcomes worth having. She put the pen down and looked at what she'd written. It sounded like a speech. She had not intended it as a speech. She would have to be careful about that. The desire to convert understanding into rhetoric was a trap. Rhetoric was for winning people to a position. Understanding was for knowing what was actually happening. The two had different jobs, and got confused too easily. She folded the paper and put it in the back of her coat pocket and went to sleep. On the 9th day after the march, the Directorate issued a communication. This was itself unprecedented. In 4 years of occupation, all communication from the Karot had come through the administrative protocols, the levies, the permits, the occasional automated alert about operational changes. This was different. This came through what the settlement's communicators identified as a diplomatic grade channel, the kind that required a biological sender rather than an automated system. Someone at the Directorate had sat down and produced this. The communication was in Karot formal administrative language, which was something between a bureaucratic dialect and a mathematical notation system, and Yale Oster spent 3 hours with 2 other long-term residents translating it before she called Mara and said, "You should come." The translation table in Yale's apartment was covered in printed drafts. 4 people were sitting around it with the look of people who had arrived at a conclusion they weren't sure what to do with. The short version, Yale said, is a request for a formal population census to be conducted by Karot auditors with human cooperation. The long version specifies that the census is for purposes of administrative reclassification review and is to be considered preliminary to possible category amendment. Mara sat down. "They want to count us," she said. "They want to count us correctly," Yale said. "The implication is that their current count is considered insufficient for administrative purposes." She looked at Mara with a careful expression. 80,000 is a number. The march gave them a number. But numbers in open space, from surveillance drones, are the kind of data the Directorate treats as approximate. A census is how they make a number official. And an official number triggers different policy frameworks. Potentially, we'd need someone with deeper access to the administrative code to say for certain. Yale folded her hands on the table. But the structure of the communication suggests that the Category 9 classification doesn't apply above a certain threshold of population concentration and documented collective organization. Someone in the Directorate believes we may be above that threshold. The room was quiet. Mara thought about the cold, the 11 kilometers, the 23 who became 25, the badly sung anthem, the silver bioluminescence. She thought about the moment on the ridge when she had looked down at the people filling the common before dawn, the red banners catching the first light. "We cooperate with the census," she said. There was a moment where no one spoke. "They'll know exactly how many of us there are," one of the men at the table said. He was new. Mara didn't know his name, and he had the wariness of someone who had recent reasons for it. "That's a security concern. They already know how many of us there are," Yale said quietly. "They have satellite coverage and 4 years of surveillance data. What they're doing isn't gathering new information about our number. They're asking us to make our number legible in a way they can officially recognize. That's a different thing. The difference between being invisible and being unresolved," Mara said. Yale looked at her. "Yes. Exactly that. They drafted a response that took 4 hours, because cooperative agreements with the Keharat needed to be written in formal administrative language, which required precision Mara did not have and Yael did, and also needed to contain nothing that could be read as a concession or a waiver of anything that might someday become relevant in a legal framework, which required a particular kind of careful thinking that made Mara's head hurt. But they drafted it. She walked home in the dark past the auditor post, which was lit in its usual pale blue gold. She thought about what it would mean to be reclassified. She didn't know what category came after 9. She didn't know what rights or protections or constraints the higher categories carried. She didn't know whether reclassification would improve anything in any material sense, or whether it was a symbolic gesture by a bureaucracy that had noticed an anomaly and needed to file it somewhere new. She knew it would mean they had been seen. She knew it would mean the model had updated. She knew it would mean that the practice, the walking, the gathering, the red banners, the badly sung anthems, the food from nowhere, the 23 who became 25, had produced a data point that the 1,000-year history of Keharat administration had not previously had to account for. That seemed like something worth building on. The census took place 3 weeks later. 42 Keharat auditors, which was more than had ever been deployed in the corridor simultaneously, moved through the settlement in small teams, and humans went with them. Not to supervise, the auditors didn't need supervising, but because Theodis Baum had argued, successfully, that human witnesses to a formal Keharat count constituted a kind of documentation that had future value, even if they couldn't yet say what that value was. Mara was assigned to the team covering the southern sub-districts, the ones with the highest population density, the ones where the resource levies had hit hardest. She walked beside an auditor whose designation she had been given as something phonetically unpresentable in human speech, and which she thought of, privately, as the one who walks slightly sideways. Not mockingly, it was just accurate, a slight lateral lean to their gait that she found, after 6 hours of walking together, oddly companionable. The auditor did not speak to her. The census was not a conversation. But at one point in the afternoon, passing through the market district, the auditor's sensor cluster swung toward a group of children playing in the space between 2 prefab structures. The particular full-tilt play of children who have found a game and committed to it entirely, loud and quick and oblivious to everything except the game. The sensor cluster tracked them for several seconds. Mara watched the auditor watching the children. She had no way of knowing what the auditor saw, what category the children in fell to, what column in what spreadsheet they occupied in the model currently being updated. She had no way of knowing whether the auditor experienced something or merely recorded something. The question of Keharat interiority was one of the most contested issues in the limited xenopsychology literature she had access to, and she held no confident opinion about it, but the sensor cluster tracked the children for a long time, longer than the census protocol required. She thought about what Yael had said. Uncertainty is the closest thing they have to mercy. She thought, maybe watching is a beginning. The final census count was delivered by the Directorate 10 days after the census concluded. The official number, the one that would go into the formal administrative record, was slightly higher than the settlement's own best estimates. Not dramatically higher, but higher. When the category amendment came, Category 7, Emerging Established Presence, with a specific sub-classification related to documented collective cultural organization, Yael read the relevant provisions aloud in a room with 30 people in it, and most of the changes were technical and had to be decoded through the administrative language into something that meant anything, and some of them were significant. The water reclamation facility was to be returned to human operational control under Keharat monitoring. The resource levies were to be reduced by a formula that still needed to be negotiated, and some of them were things they didn't yet know how to evaluate. Nobody celebrated, not quite. But afterward, people stood around the room in the particular way of people who have received news that they need time to understand, talking quietly, and someone had produced food again, and someone else had produced something to drink that was not tea. And the feeling in the room was the feeling of people who are not at the end of something, who know they are not at the end of something, but who are at a place that is different from where they were, which is a beginning, or the closest thing to one available. Mara stood at the edge of the room and thought about her grandmother. She thought about the second march that was already being planned for the spring, bigger this time, with organized sections and mapped routes and coordination with the two other settlements in the corridor that had watched the first one and asked to be included. She thought about the census documentation that was already being compiled, the written record of the event, the data that would exist outside the carrot systems, in human hands, in human language, for future use in frameworks that did not yet exist. She thought about what it meant to be legible. The drone was still overhead. The auditor posts were still staffed. The Kefrat satellites still tracked every significant movement in the corridor, and the Directorate's administrative Ashamlushil still held humans within a category, still processed them through a model, still calculated their resource value and management requirements and projected compliance behavior. The occupation had not ended. The power differential that made it possible had not changed. The 1,000 years of Kirat Sifra civilization that looked at every other species and saw something to be managed rather than met had not been argued out of its fundamental orientation by one cold march and a badly sung song. But the model had updated, Category 7. Mara went outside into the corridor evening where the cold was coming back, where the narrow habitable band of sky was going dark above her, and she breathed the air and thought about all the things that were still wrong and all the things that had shifted and the distance between those two inventories, which was large enough to be discouraging and small enough to be meaningful. And she decided, as she had decided every day for 4 years and would decide again tomorrow, that the distance was what you walked into. She pulled her coat tighter. She started walking.